Front and center, men. This is the official podcast of the Center for Syncretic Studies. I'm Tim Kirby, and with me, as always, is
Joaquin Flores. Good to be with you, Tim.
good to be with you as well. Today, this week, it's my pick for the topic, and my pick is inspired by the fact that recently here in Russia we had some elections, minor elections, the least important elections of just sort of local deputies and all that. But we're also entering the sort of electoral cycle for the next presidential elections in America. In fact, we've probably already entered it, as we've talked before in a previous episode about Mr. Yang. So I kind of want to just talk about democracy, maybe a little bit about elections, because I think our opinions might not quite line up on this issue, Joaquin. Because it's no fun to do this podcast where we always agree with each other. Because my opinion is a bit extreme. My argument is that democracy, as we understand it, Western-style democracy, does not exist. Okay? And the first thing I want to throw out there is when you say to someone that you think something doesn't exist, they think that you mean that you're against it, okay? So when I say that I don't think that democracy, as in we, the masses, because I know we're going to get into, someone's going to say that the word democracy actually comes from being related to the population of cities, which ignores people in the rural areas. But democracy, the word as we understand it today, of the people having the power, the people, the masses, nowhere have power. They have never had power. We have maybe some power, but we do not have control over the system. That is a farce. That is not true. Now, when someone hears that, they must mean, so you're advocating a fascist dictatorship. No, I'm not. But what I'm saying is that we don't really have the power, and that regardless of what country you are, so this isn't a Russia or America thing, it's not a China thing, it's not a North Korea thing, it's not an Africa thing, it's not a South America thing, although South America's a continent, not a country, so is Africa. It is just a systemic thing, is that I don't think it's really possible for the masses to have power. Now, Joaquin, before you jump in here, I'm going to just get into with elections, because this is something that I've always found fascinating, is that people who even find the government to be terrifying, right? Trump is a Nazi. The government is, the U.S. government is guilty of this, that, and the other evil crimes, and yet everyone is absolutely sure that despite the fact that they've maybe even heard in the mainstream news some things about gerrymandering, electoral manipulations, that whoever won the election, that's the president, and that's the way it is, and that it was fair. Okay? And the thing is that in any country, wherever you are, essentially what you sort of have is you have a choice between approved choices. And I would argue that when your only choices are pre-approved choices, then you don't really actually have a choice. You see what I mean? Am I going off in the left field here?
Well, I was thinking maybe you'd want to define, because when you say democracy doesn't exist in the United States,
Anywhere.
Okay, anywhere. What do you mean by exist?
As in, it's that we, okay, so that actually, so our idea, okay, so say you ask a person, who really is in power in the United States? Some people just might answer the government because they're tired, but in theory, it's the fact that we believe this idea of democracy, where we the people, through the process of elections and the occasional referendum, we're the ones who actually have the power, and that the people in government are supposed to be civil servants to us, that we're the boss because we choose them. Okay? And so that is what I'm referring to as a farce or non-existent, because that is not possible. For example, a lot of times, I've always liked this argument that libertarians make, but they make it for a different reason. They'll be like, well, can you tax the government? No, the government can tax you, okay? Can you force the government to go fight in the war of your choosing? No, but they can force you. Now, when they talk about that, they're usually going down this sort of a logic line that you can't force people to do things, you need small government, da-da-da. But I actually think that system of logic that they use actually is an answer to the fact that democracy really can't exist. Because government is essentially the means by which elections can happen, right? But if we are the ones, basically, if we're the ones with the power and we're choosing the people in the government, then how can the government be the ones that set up the electoral system by which we choose them? You see what I mean? Or if there's something like corruption or crime, only the government is able to punish government crime.
Is that sort of like a who polices the police argument?
It's kind of like that. But like I said, it's more, I really like the way the libertarians phrase it. It's just I don't care about their whole small government is awesome thing after that. But it really is, yeah, it's who polices the police, who taxes the tax authorities, who drafts the draft board.
Well, let me ask you. So, if you're
Yeah.
saying that, are you saying that democracy doesn't exist and that therefore that means that it's impossible? Or that we don't have any, are you saying that we don't have any empirical evidence to suppose that it could be possible because it's never existed anywhere?
I would say it's impossible because I'm one of those people where as I've gotten older, and I've looked back on things, I think society really hasn't changed that much. I mean, there's still an elite, there's still the masses, and then there's maybe some sort of middle ground, upper middle class, sort of between them, and that really things don't change. And that when we talk about also power, right? So we define power, your ability to assert force on others. What a power do the masses have other than say rioting? But then again, with the way the human mind works, human beings, despite what the media portrays, don't actually just one day stand up and decide it's revolution time. That's all very organized, pre-planned by other people. So maybe the masses have power in their ability to riot, but then again, that's still organized. So essentially, the ability to project force doesn't really exist anywhere. There's no sort of group of people or country where the masses exert a controlled, conscious force on the government.
So, what about a definition of democracy? That it was the that the democracy was the product of the competition between power groups or between vested interests. Like
Well,
setting aside like elections and the media and all that. Just you have
mhm.
different. Well, make a comparison to Russian society. So in Russian society,
Close to home. All right, bring it on.
there's pillars of there's different pillars of Russian power, and
Yeah.
they're sort of in competition with each other to a certain extent. Now, the security agency may try to balance them or play one against the other, but they're in competition.
hmm Well, yeah, because that's sort of like if we're talking about Russia specifically, that's what a lot of people consider to be one of the big triumphs of Putin. Is so during the Yeltsin era, the big group of people who really held the power and were really determining the policy were big business and big international business, big liberal international business. And what Putin was able to do was to shift away from big business that serves whoever, because international business and business in general is very whorish. That's not to say that we don't need business and we all need to go live in a cave without consumer goods. It's just business has a very whorish nature and it serves whatever master that feeds it, right? And so one of the big things was to try to shift away from that. And so now many people consider that the real power base in Russia is more based in security. It's more the military, Secret Service, and those guys are definitely well off. But it's not so much the business interests as it used to be. So in that sense, if you're talking about is there a battle for power, there's always a battle for power. There's always a battle for power between various different groups. In fact, I believe if we're going to open up would it be sociology? Oh no, one of our textbooks. I think this might fall under sociology. But there's the term the keys to power, and that every great king had to possess the keys to power, be it control over the military or mercenaries or whatever, tradesmen, various different groups within society in order to keep himself afloat. And I think that this whole keys to power scenario still exists. So in a way, yes, there is a fight for power, but it's not this fight for power that includes Joe Blow on the street in the Bronx or Farmer Fred out in Iowa. You see what I mean? It's
Yes,
still very much the battle between the elite who are in the chairs versus people who are in the elite or close to the elite who want those fancy chairs. You
but
know?
do in this battle of elites,
Uh-huh.
for them to leverage against each other in their competition, and then the way that the game is set up, where access to government or access to a part of government power is through this electoral process, and you
hmm
have something like one man, one vote.
Yeah.
So then, in this inter-elite conflict, wouldn't some part of the elite try to appeal to some core circle of interests that affect Joe Blow, and then wouldn't then isn't it about then like at the end of the day, when the next election cycle comes, isn't it sort of like a recounting of did you fulfill the campaign promises kind of thing?
Well, that's a big thing. I'm going to jump on a little bit of an aside, not to avoid your question, but you mentioned the thing of campaign promises. Because that's another thing is, okay, about democracy, right? So I'm going to go, I'm a Mr. Republican guy today. I'm wearing a Republican hat, we'll say. And I go and I'm like, I don't like taxation. I like conservative social values. You know what? All these Republican guys, they promise that they're going to do this, that, and the other. Going to lower my taxes. Okay, vote for that. There's no means to guarantee that their taxes are going to get lower or not, or even that they're going to try to do that. There's really no, essentially, oversight over the actions of the candidates. In fact, there's been sort of a movement within Russia to create this sort of complex system of oversight by which people will be sort of kicked out of office permanently if they can't at least prove that they tried to fight for the positions they offered, which is interesting, but nothing has come of that yet because obviously what government official is going to bring in that policy? You know what I mean?
Right.
Where they have to live up to their campaign promises? Yeah, right. That ain't happening.
Yeah,
But that idea has been kicked
campaign
around.
finance reform
Yeah.
or
It's
term
the same
limits.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I can understand it. I mean, there are people like me who are nuts and who would be like, okay, well, yeah, I could probably make a couple $1 million a year in bribes, but I care about America and let's make America great again. I'm nuts enough to do that, but I'm a small percent of the population. So that's not going to happen because I think there's a lot of people who are very comfortable getting, what is it, $1,600,000 on average campaign contributions in order to go to a job that pays $200,000. So I think they're happy about that. But
Well,
anyways,
let me pick
so-
your brain.
Yeah.
Because, okay, so
Well,
when
I
you said,
got to interrupt you because the one thing is, how can we have democracy, a system where we have power, where even if we do have a very fair voting system, there is no guarantee that the majority will get what they voted for. There's zero guarantee. Okay, go. Take it. Take it
okay,
away.
so the way I have it scored is not too different from you. I was hoping that we could disagree.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to yell at you today.
Yeah, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I guess I might have the word existence defined differently. So, I have existence like things that are empirically observable. So that's pretty much limited to things that you can use your 5 or 6 senses to pick up. If I can't, like falling is, falling exists. Smells you observe, like things you can see, things you can touch. Democracy is a process, so I have processes as part of reality, but there's no such object called existence. So I would say that democracy doesn't exist in the literal sense. It's not empirically observable. Now, so then it gets down to, is the thing that you're observing, it's subjective in terms of, let me back up. So if you and I were both looking at a table and we both spoke the same language, then we would probably both agree that it was a table. And we might disagree as to like what color we call it, but it would be pretty hard to argue that if we were both looking at a table
one person could call it a desk.
Yeah, right. And we could agree, there are desks that look like that.
So we're going into the semantics realm. So, okay, so let's cancel this because the other day I was in a little discussion on Facebook. I try not to argue over Facebook, but sometimes I get drawn in there. And I referred to someone's works where I should have used the word books because work sounds kind of grandiose and everyone that ended any interesting discussion because it was like, works, how could you say works, and it means this and it means that and it means that. It meant nothing when I said it. I should have said books. But anyways, going back to our topic, right? Okay, so maybe exists is the wrong term. How about this? Democracy, as it's portrayed in the mainstream media and the mainstream understanding, does not work that way. And in fact, the promise of the ideal democracy that we hold in our minds is farcical. Is that better? Is that a more...
Okay, well, that's two different things now. Because before I was asking you, are you saying that, and I would say it's not a reality, are you saying it's not a reality and therefore it's not possible? Are you saying that it's not an ideal that's worth striving for? because it's not a noble ideal, or because there's too many factors that get in the way of that? Those
I
are
am
like
very,
two different arguments.
totally on the side of not possible, because I am a person that believes that it is absolutely worth it to strive for things that are impossible. Okay, impossible standards, because essentially piety, any sort of like high moral situation is impossible. For example, as someone who lives in Russia, right? Now, when we talk about Russia, and I see foreigners talk about Russia, there's more exposure to Russia, and there is this sort of projection of Russia that we are the third Rome, we are the most Christian place in Europe, which it's kind of the way it has become. So statistically, if people who believe, the amount of churches that are growing, church attendance, big marches, and all that, we're the most Christian place in Europe. But then again, you get some TV shows on mainstream media that are very soft LGBT. A lot of consumerism. You go around Moscow and you see the same parade of hipster freaks that you do anywhere in the world. And then people are like, well, how can you say that Russia has conservative values? Because it's something to strive for something and fail or be in the process of it than to not at all try and reject it. Because in Western Europe, with a lot of this things, people think the hipster freak show is normal. And that's fine, and that's okay, and people can be that way. Many of the people who are involved in ideology, Russian culture, do not like the current trends. They're fighting against it. They're failing, but they're fighting against it. And you see, that's the difference. And could we ever have a pious nation? Oh, fuck no. I shouldn't have swore because it's YouTube. But no. There is never going to be a nation of, we're at 150 million people now, and maybe some other former territories of Russia might jump back on board, bring us up to whatever. But you are never going to get millions and millions of people to be pious.
But is it worth striving for?
Striving for? Yes, it is.
Okay,
it is
so is
absolutely
democracy worth striving for?
I'm not sure. Certain aspects of it. I would say more fairness is definitely worth striving for. Because I think the thing that we want out of democracy is fairness. We want a system that's fair, and we also want a system where we have a say. That's definitely worth fighting for. Those aspects of it.
So then, so then hypothetically, to help like deconstruct this quandary that we're in here,
break it down.
Would you say that if it were possible to hold politicians accountable, if it were possible, then would you say it's worth striving for?
Well,
hypothetically,
given that we're stuck in the current system we're stuck in,
I'm saying hypothetically. I'm agreeing with you.
Hypothetically about this. This is one sort of nuanced thing, which isn't really. It's not really a core part of the argument I'm making here. It's kind of a side thing.
Sure.
The problem is it'd be very hard to do, but you're making the supposition that it's possible.
No, I'm just saying
yes,
hypothetical. Well, yeah, for the hypothetical.
Hypothetically, yes. Why?
Because I'm trying to draw out if it's worth fighting for, not whether it exists or if it's a reality.
Okay. Because so if you have this system where either there's zero responsibility, people vote for a candidate based on certain promises, and there's absolutely zero accountability, or a system in which there's some accountability. Obviously, the system with some accountability is more democratic, and thus better, because the people voting or making selections or referendums or whatever the hell you want to do actually has value, guaranteed value, by the way.
What about so some people have said, for example, so why would we need representatives to go to a physical building? We don't need people to go to a physical building to work. We don't need these things because of digital processes. So if it were possible, setting aside the technological barriers and hacking, again, another huge hypothetical, what if people directly voted for ballot measures or for, like referendums, and that instead of having elected representatives, that direct issues were put to the voters, and then the voters online or whatever directly voted for those things, so that there were no legislators that could pretend to be doing things. So then
well, Joaquin, what you're trying to say is that that's like a direct Athenian democracy via the internet. And I know for a lot of people that sounds very attractive, but I don't think that that is going to work because any sort of online. Now, one thing you said, who are these people who don't want a big group of individuals in suits sitting around a room making laws? I'm that person, okay? But that's a different issue. When we're talking about electronic digital democracy, which is also popular on the Russian internet, again, it's a question of oversight because online it's so much easier to fake things than in real life. In real life, faking things is easy too, but it's still way harder and takes more effort. And online, and again, it's also who chooses the issues, right? Again, whoever chooses those issues to be voted on makes the decision. And also, here's one thing where might get a little bit of heat. Because I'm in the masses, the masses, we're a little dumb, okay? Because people are going to vote to get more stuff and not have to pay for it. That's what a lot of naive people do, and if we give people, the masses, the opportunity to get this, and this social program while cutting this, and this tax, that's what they're going to vote for. That's going to be impossible.
Right.
Because it takes a more long-term view, understanding of the economy, and it really does take a certain amount of expertise, hopefully, to make these kinds of decisions. Because look at people when they do interviews about why we're going to vote for a candidate. With Obama, it was just, he's Obama. It's hope and change. Oh boy, what kind of plan for America is that hope and change? Change to what? From what? No one answered that question. Make America great again is a little bit easier to understand, but it's still very abstract. Trump could just do anything. He's like, I'm making America great again. By what means, sir? So I don't think that people really could, the average person, make those decisions. And that's another thing why I don't like having so many politicians, because, Joaquin, I have had the chance, especially in the past, not a long time ago, not since I moved to Russia anyways, well, I have met Russian politicians, talked to a couple American politicians, did some, former, I should say. Some interviews with former politicians that never got published. Maybe one day I'll be allowed to publish them. And one thing I can tell you is there are some smart ones out there, but a lot of people, they're just like you and me. In fact, way worse.
So let me ask this.
And they're making these big decisions, and
right.
they do not know what the hell they're talking
Well, let me
about.
put it like this. Yeah. So if you had a direct referendum and people just could vote directly on ballots, digitally or whatever, that would kind of function as like having one giant lower house, like so you would have a monocameral legislature, just the demos or the Laos, and then they would digitally directly vote on the ballot measures, and then that would result in people just voting for free stuff for themselves.
No.
Among other things. Okay.
Well, here's
hold on. Let me walk you through this because I'm asking you a question. So then it sounds like what you're saying is that there would have to be some check on that to balance the tendency of the masses to just vote directly in their interests for things that are impossible to actually do, because people would vote for rights, but without a mechanism to hold themselves accountable, to have the responsibility to make those rights realizable, to make those privileges or those rights. I shouldn't confuse those terms, but I'm just trying to wrap my head around what you're saying and draw out to a logical conclusion, being that it sounds like there would have to be another group of people that were like experts and maybe had a vested interest in the stuff that would be given away. And maybe it's because they own a disproportionate amount of that stuff that would be given away to everyone else in the event that they voted for it. So then that sounds kind of like a bicameral legislature, like the upper house or like the Senate or the House of Lords.
Well, yeah, that's actually like having a house of commons in the most direct sense of being the commoners against a house of big business.
Right, a house of big business concept. Or a Senate or a Senate or a House of Lords, and then when that House of Lords, if people realize that democracy is in your term, doesn't exist or it's kind of a lie, then they might lose faith in the system.
Yeah.
So maybe the rationality of the system is that the House of Lords pretends that it's a democracy when really it's just a republic. And then they say that they're trying to work towards the things that the people want, but in reality they know that they can never really deliver on them.
Yeah. Oh, well, then again, we're going back to the whole striving towards things we can't achieve. But
Yeah.
the problem is the masses are never actually told that.
Right.
Politicians in Washington don't actually say that. We don't tell people, because we actually do live in republics.
Yeah.
That's another thing about democracy not existing. We all live in constitutional republics, except for countries that don't have constitutions and have like some sort of common law that acts in place of a constitution. So that's the non-existent thing. But, it's again about that whole accountability factor. To be honest, what I think, and I'm trying to write about this in a book that I'll never get finished, unfortunately work always drags me away from it, is I really actually think that one of the key problems in our government right now is the division between the executive and legislative branch. Because if you start to think about it, if you're working at a job, any job, okay, and you have someone come in, some client, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. They make all these demands, and they want you to do it, and you tell them, well, I don't know, we're building a house, and you tell them, well, making a custom staircase that's made out of bending wooden branches to be in place of the railings. Well, that's going to cost a lot of money. We're going to have to bend these branches. In fact, our guys can't do that. We're going to have to bring in a guy who knows about bending wood, who's going to be able to bend all this into place. That's going to be like $5,000. Like, how could it be $5,000? It's just made of wood. Da-da-da. And you get into these sort of situations of someone who has no idea what the F they're talking about is ordering something. And the people who have to do it then suffer because they are at the they have to bow to this idiot and their stupid desires. And I think that that's the real dynamic between the legislative and executive branch. So going back to a more plausible example, okay, so how many people in the U.S. Congress right now have a medical background, for example? I don't think many. There have been doctors. Ron Paul was a medical doctor, right? So there's at least one at one time. But I'm going to roughly guess a small percent. And yet those people in this room have to make decisions that affect all of our medical care in the whole country when they're not experts at it. Now, the person who is in theory in some country, the Minister of Health or whatever, Surgeon General in the United States, that would actually be a person who should be able to make that decision. And yet they're not. So you have the Surgeon General being given, maybe they ask him for advice, him or, I think it might be a she right now, I forgot. Him or her for advice. They give the advice, but still they don't make the bills. They don't make the rules. And I think that that's actually part of the problem. The people who execute the laws actually do need to be the ones who determine the direction of the laws. Now, having some sort of group of judges or philosophers or clergy or other group who can tell them, no, what you're trying to do is against the spirit of our nation, that's fine. That doesn't create the problem. But this whole fact that Congress, or it's not just Congress, it's any parliament, Congress, whatever. If there's a specific thing, be it the military, be it medicine or education, there will never, ever, ever be a moment where the majority of those people sitting in that big room in their leather chairs actually knows what the hell they're talking about regarding what they're voting on. Never.
Well, when insofar as politicians or government is involved in healthcare or education, they're not really involved in the practice of pedagogy or the practice of medicine. It's more from the bureaucratic, how do we balance the books, how do we determine who gets what, and those are more like functionalist.
Now, I don't know about that, because a lot of standards can come from I mean, even my children have taken a couple months to study in America, and we've already run into, well, the state says this, well, the state says this policy, that policy, you have to do this, that, and the other. I mean, even when I was in a university, the government of Pennsylvania demanded that 33% of all classes must be core curriculum. I went to a design school. What do I need to know about biology for that? The school thought it was stupid. All the teachers thought it was stupid, including the teacher who taught biology. But no. There is budgeting. There is the let's move papers around to move the budget here and there. There is that, but there's definitely an ideological core component to this, and these people don't know what the hell they're talking
Well,
about.
sure. I mean,
Again,
a good example of what you're saying
that's
is
why I
that,
want to have basically maybe what we need in the future is maybe if we have to have three branches of government because everyone loves it, the equivalent of like a cabinet of ministers. You know, you have defense or war, health, transport. Maybe that's really who needs to get together. These sort of single individuals are the people who really need to be then determining policy, and then maybe pass it to the president or Kaiser, emperor, whatever the hell you want to call them, who will actually make it happen. If we have to have three things, because I'll tell you another thing. The human mind, we can only remember so many things. One of the reasons my life is miserable is because I have to remember way more things per day than I could possibly ever do. And so it always kind of creates a lot of stress for me. Now, I think the average person could think about, say, 7 things at a time or 9 things at a time, which is actually pretty good. But still, we can't know everything.
I mean, you could like write things down, make lists.
You can. But when it comes to picking your politicians again, so for example, let's go around Russia. I can tell you. Name some politicians. Okay, we have Putin, he's the president, right? Medvedev is the prime minister who used to be president. Everyone knows him. And then you're going to get to Shoigu, who's in charge of the military. Then it's going to start to get a little bit grayer. You've got Lavrov for the international relations. And then it's going to get grayer and grayer and grayer. And even myself, I'm tempted to open up a Google search to as a cheat sheet because I'm forgetting at the moment. Now, could someone, if they were voting, right, could someone go, okay, so I have the choice between Shoigu, defense minister, and some other guy. Well, I have to be honest with you, Joaquin. People are very happy with the way the military is developing. The military here in the 90s and up until Shoigu came in, it was a national tragedy, humiliating, totally inefficient, totally corrupt and all that. And he came in and now the military actually works. So guess what? They're going to see and they're going to like, oh, okay, I remember that guy. People are telling me the military is good. Okay, I'm going to vote for him. So if you have this sort of personal thing where there's very, very few people, where you're actually sort of maybe even voting for like a mini dictator of who's going to be in charge of defense, you are much more likely to get the results you want from that vote than I'm in District 74 of Maryland. Well, it's Russia. I'm in District 13 of Volgograd. So who am I voting for? I'll just vote for United Russia because I'm afraid of change. Okay, done. Stamp. You see what I mean?
So, but in a republic like the United States, I mean, the president also has a cabinet. And there is and he appoints those directly. I mean, there's he appoints the finance minister, which is the head of the Federal Reserve. Mm-hmm. He appoints the defense minister. Basically, he appoints the foreign minister, the Secretary of State. So those are all appointed by the president, and they have extraordinary powers. And then you have the Senate, and they represent. There's 2 from each state, so there's 100 senators in the states, right? And they there's things that they can override the Congress, and the congressional seats are divided up more by the population center, so it's more of a democratic mechanism, whereas like the Senate is like the democracy between the states, but it also they have more power, so the stakes are bigger, so then there's more financing.
It's a
campaign
balance,
costs more.
Of powers, yeah.
So then the people who are more like financially not responsible, but let's say financially interested, put more money in the senatorial individual races. So then they expect the senators to act on behalf of moneyed interests a little bit more than they do for the the lower house of Congress.
But yeah.
So
Well, you're just kind of making the argument again of why I think we would also sort of then need a mini dictator of all the different cabinet positions, who would all be the combination of the legislative and executive branches in function, because then there's one guy. It all goes down to him.
so then
You
what's
can
to
watch
prevent a coup?
You can watch his wallet.
I mean,
A
it seems that since World War II,
Yeah.
that they created a military-industrial complex, and then they used like a corporatist model using the shareholder of like corporatism as a model, and then they said, okay, so all the generals and high-ranking guys are also going to be shareholders in Raytheon, General Electric, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, and so forth, like the American version of Kalishnikov and combines like this, right? So then those guys, if the country were to, if the interests of the military industrial complex is at odds with the interests of the average guy, then if you had like a, let's say more like a centralized executive branch, you're saying that the executive branch was more powerful, then, but ultimately the executive branch has to have control over the security services and has to have control over the military, which means there has to be a different way to pay these generals money that's not connected to the stock value of the companies that make up the military industrial complex. So, and then it seems that we're back to square one, because like the reason that democracy is a lie or doesn't exist, as you say, is that they can't actually go through with the reforms and the changes that they promised the people because of the corporate industrial moneyed interests that have a conflicting interest with those of the average Joe.
There is, but essentially, like again, it's going back to when we, with the way human beings see things, we cannot pay attention to so many damn people in the room. And when responsibility can be spread a bit. There is a certain logic to having checks and balances, but when everything is so split that no one is responsible, that is the ultimate nightmare.
Yes.
And I think that that's really what we're hearing.
So you're saying if you had fewer people that were easier to hold responsible. Well, you see, that's interesting you say that, because I've been of the view that sometimes communist dictatorships were in a sense more democratic because it was easy to point out, who was effing up.
Yeah. And that was also in some ways a weakness. In some ways it was, because definitely in Russia it was like, well, today I had a good day, thank you Communist Party. I had a bad day, I hate you Communist Party. So there is that side to it. No, literally, I mean that, and still even to this day, in a lot of ways, that sort of reasoning sort of thinks where the media and a lot of people, especially people who are more nuts and simple-minded, Putin is their everything. He is either the thing that brought up the sun, or he is the thing that's keeping them from being successful in their career as a skateboarder.
Yeah, we have the same in Serbia with Vucic.
Yeah.
Well, so let me ask you then. So in this last election, I understand that the Communist Party did fairly well, speaking of that.
Yeah, actually, they did. Because that's another thing about, we're going to, as you know, if anyone's listened to our previous episodes, we know we talk about a lot about media manipulation, especially I work in the media, so I'm definitely aware, because I have to fight against it like every day of my life. And you'll see that they'll be like, all of the opposition parties in Russia won, especially Moscow. The Moscow opposition parties won. Now, the word opposition party, normally, opposition party, when the West uses it different than Russia. In Russia, opposition party means everyone except United Russia. Everyone except the big mainstream party. There's sort of a formal opposition and an informal opposition. The informal opposition being the people who are willing to destroy this country to get what they want, and the formal opposition being the people who try to make political parties that disagree with the key central main party, right? Now, in the West, usually they consider, like the Communist Party and the Liberal Democratic Party and Just Russia or Fair Russia, I always forget the translation, they consider them to be basically in the boat. They're still a recognized party. They're part of, Team Putin, so they don't really count as opposition. Usually they write that way. Until the communists won a lot of seats. Now, because that narrative that the opposition is rising serves their interests, they're writing about it. and calling them opposition, where in the past they didn't. It's
Well,
amazing.
but Tim, in the United States, the two
Yeah.
parties seem to mostly agree, and I mean they're not really. I mean, the United States, the term it seems like this. What I'm trying to say is this: that I agree with what you're saying. So what I get from that, though, is that in the United States, Democrats and Republicans are kind of like two sides of the same coin. There really
Yeah.
isn't a real opposition party in the United States. I mean, well, one could argue that Obama campaigned as a sort of, break the box, break the machine kind of guy. Trump kind of campaigned as a break the box kind of guy. I've seen some real differences in Trump's foreign policy compared to predecessors, but I think that was more of a reflection of the empire kind of having run out of gas. So maybe a different candidate would have had to make a lot of the same decisions, but just maybe couch them differently. Whereas maybe Trump, because of the narrative that he built into his campaign, I'm going to make a point here,
I'm
maybe
waiting.
was in some way more honest about the prospects of American foreign policy in the future. So, but it seems that opposition parties in the United States for quite a good number of decades, and that's as far back as I can remember, and before that I wasn't born, going back more than 40 years ago. So it seems that opposition in the United States has only been a two-party system, but it seems that like in parliamentary democracies or parliamentary republics like Russia, I would consider Russia to be like a social democracy because of the healthcare, education, and broader parliamentary system. So you have sort of like France, like Germany, like European countries, and like Russia, you have a sort of a social democracy, and with a bigger social net for society, for retirees, for the elderly. You have free universities and so forth, and healthcare. So then it seems that in addition to that, that what opposition in Russia means the same thing as opposition, anywhere else. I mean, you're talking about pro-system opposition,
Yeah.
but when the United States and their media says opposition, they're talking about Navalny and like guys that
Yeah.
the U.S. supports, but that not more than like 1% or 2% or maybe 15% of Muscovites would ever vote for, right? So opposition in Western media kind of means who America supports, and that's the opposition. But in Russia, it means
Well, yeah, and exactly that's why they're writing articles where they're saying the opposition won, even though they're communists who don't really particularly like U.S. policy. The opposition won, yeah.
So that's actually very confusing on the part of U.S. messaging because they're showing images of Navalny and pictures of Navalny saying opposition did much stronger, but then when you read the article, it's not this small, pro-Atlanticist liberal opposition. They're actually saying that it was the Communist Party did very well, and they're kind of more close to the system than not.
Yeah, I would do think in Moscow, though, the Yabloko or Apple Party, which is very Atlanticist, anti-Russian, but is an officially recognized party, they got, I think, a few seats, like 2 or 3 or something of the big, I think it was 45. My memory sucks, as I've mentioned before.
But that's more than they've gotten in recent years.
They are a recognized party. They legit. It's legit. But like I said, Moscow is the epicenter of Russian liberalism, so they're always going to get maybe a couple seats in there. And it's also, of course, easier to win a local city deputy position than it is to win a national for the Duma election and get seats in that. That's a whole nother ballgame.
So what's interesting to me is also that I think the most unpopular thing that Putin has done in recent years is move to raise the retirement age or to change the pension structure, something like that.
His approval rating will never be the same after that. He ate 15 points of approval rating that day, and they'll never come back. So.
Yeah, elaborate on that some more if you could.
Well, I can tell you one thing: is there's a new crisis in Russia. The first crisis was Russia's dying. Now the crisis is Russia's living. Before Putin came to power, I think the average lifespan was like 55 or something years, and now it's 67, 69. Basically, there's been a lifespan explosion in Russia, And that's how they're reacting to it. Now, the thing is, I'm not going to just believe what the news media here says. They're like, well, people are living a lot longer. I mean, look at the statistics there. It's like way longer. It's like a 15-year difference. Yeah. So what? Why can't? We live in a very rich country. Why can't you pay more for pension? Because they're like, well, you have to put money into the pension fund. You know, in the Soviet Union, from what I understand, from my humble position, the way I understand their pension system, or Social Security, as we call it in America, was basically all the people who are working now put money in, and that money is distributed to the people who are over the age of 55 to live on. Bada bing, bada boom, distributed. Of course, some people had better pensions who did dangerous jobs. All right, there you go. Now the system now is this whole thing where it's more like in America where you work now, so that way money goes into a fund, so you get it when you're retired. And that's a lot more shady, and I don't like that. I think that was one thing that the communists actually did do right. It's just whoever's alive now gives money to whoever's retired now immediately and get rid of the opportunity to steal this. Because there is a famous video on the internet, was it 5 years ago? Some of the top people in the pension fund were arrested for corruption. So that's where it's going. I know the American Social Security system is very under suspect that it might actually be in the red. So we'll see when we hit 65, won't we?
So the outcome of the elections in Russia, how accurate was Western reportage versus the reality on the ground?
Well, the thing is, there wasn't too much Western reporting because, like I said, this was more for like local deputies and stuff. It wasn't so much for like the big position. But the one thing is that we have to understand is that the most stable countries in the former Soviet Union, so we have Russia and Kazakhstan and Belarus, who are really stable. The other former Soviet republics, well, there's the Baltics who became part of the EU and have just basically been culturally, demographically, economically raped into non-existence. They don't really count. So that's -3 of 15, so we're left with 12 minus the big three.
Ukraine
is about 9. Ukraine, yeah, that's where we're looking at just a nightmare of where there isn't a big central party and then little parties. You have a total lack of stability. Everything falls apart. I guess it has something to do with the Eurasian mindset and the way people are. But people here in the stable countries have a massive core central party that is the status quo.
Belarus?
And then other little parties. Yeah, Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan. And the thing is that people in the former Soviet Union are now very scared of change. Well, except in Kiev, apparently. Overall, very scared of change. And so they're not voting for a party. People in America don't understand this. If you're from America, you think, well, I believe that we should have socialized medicine. I'm going to vote for a Democrat. No one in Russia thinks that. They think, am I going to vote for the status quo or am I going to vote for change? And most people are afraid of change, and they're like, look, things are more or less getting better over time. We're kind of slowly going in the right direction, seeing some new roads, seeing some new equipment at the hospital. I'll just go status quo. Now, what happened with the pension reform is we see now, I think it's a response to people are like, okay, that pension thing, now I'm going to have to work till the day I die. F the status quo. Maybe not to a degree, because obviously United Russia still comes in first place. But a big chunk of the population, maybe people who are more my age, who have a lot of work left to do in their lives, are like, no, not having it.
So do you think it was predictable on the part of Putin that he was going to take a 15-point hit on that move to change the...
Well, I was talking about his popularity.
Yeah, that's what I mean. What did I say?
Oh, yeah, but no, his popularity rating is going to, obviously, because there were a few, there's certain key issues, right? In America, key issues, abortion, guns, healthcare, taxation. In Russia, it's definitely different. But one of the things about Russia is, and about Russians is, that's very different from Americans. Russians do not care what the system is as long as they do okay in it. And that's also very important to understand. Now, maybe with the exception of, because everyone here died fighting Nazi Germany, no Nazi symbolism, but if someone came here and brought the same basic like economic system and no one noticed, they'd be like, as long as I get paid. Okay, so that's a big difference in mentality here. People want the system to pay out, and that's really all they care about, and otherwise they'll deal with their own problems. And that's why a lot of libertarians like being here, because no one here believes in libertarian principles, but there's a sort of incidental libertarianism, I call it, where no one cares what you do, as long as the public doesn't see it. Whatever you do at home, no one cares. and deal with your stuff yourself. You know, just so because that's sort of the more Russian attitude. There is a certain Russian attitude where people wait around for the government to fix their elevator, but if they have control over their apartment and they can make it nice, they'll make it as nice as they possibly can because it's theirs. It's kind of a weird paradox. But anyways, that's kind of the mentality here. So it's very different from America in terms of what people want and why they vote for something. Again, no one here is going to go and be like, but I care about my democracy, so I vote for... No, doesn't matter. Who's going to pay out? That's what matters.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the pragmatism. I would think that Americans would be similar, except that the middle class culture in America is bent on abstract. The culture is different, and one might tie it to the tradition of Protestantism and how there's a lack of religion in the truly, I would say, spiritual sense, institutional spiritual sense. So, for example, in my travels in the world and living in the Slavic world, what I've noticed is that whether a person, how you determine if a person's like a good human being or not, is not at all based on their political views. And whereas in the United States, I don't know if it's because of the relationship between church and state, in terms of like, do people have some kind of innate or natural desire for there to be some moral connection to our legislative or political opinions? It seems that in the United States that it's the partisan divide is such that your moral character is reflected in your political orientation.
Well, Joaquin, that's definitely in Russia too. I mean, if you're talking about virtue signaling and that,
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's just that the divide is different. So, for example, right in America, you have, I don't know, the Democrats are usually pro-secular and the Republicans are more pro-religious to a certain extent. Whereas in Russia, if you're a political party and you're anti-religious, then you're going to be the Yabloko Apple Party, who gets nothing. You see what I mean? Because Russia's more of a more homogenous culture. So if you're going to take the position of being, let's say, because basically all the parties that are in power right now, about certain, like maybe fundamental ideological positions, they're very in line. So Christianity, good. Military, good. Being strong Russia, being proud of Russia, good. And having a Russia that has influential on the international stage, good. You don't get this sort of two-party dynamic, and in fact, that's why one of the leaders, the leader of the LDPR party, Zhirinovsky, even said that he really wants to form a two-party system within Russia and wants to unite the other smaller parties, opposition parties, into one big mass so that can happen. Because that's one of the other problems when you're voting is some of these key philosophical issues, there is no difference. You know what I mean? It's just more like, well, we all project the same values, but maybe with what flavor or how we're going to do it. You know, LDPR, they kind of want you to have more freedom to do it on your own. The communists want more freedom to control things so they can do it, but ultimately what they're doing is kind of the same.
So what things from the political processes in Russia do you think that could work in America or that Americans could learn from?
Well, again, we're talking about someone who's very skeptical about the whole democratic process as a whole. But what would work in America from here, the way it works? Because I don't think the system here in America or Russia works particularly extremely well. Maybe the sort of symbiosis in church and state, but then in America we have 5 billion versions of Christianity, so that would never work. Maybe, you know how when one kid will pick on another kid and they'll be like, stop hitting yourself, as they force them to punch themselves. That's what I kind of want to say to America about stop hating yourselves and the whole West in general. We've talked about this before. Stop hating yourselves because of some sort of imperialism that used to be or because of whatever. Just knock it off. And thankfully, the culture of this self-hate of, oh, we're Russians. We used to have an empire. We're so bad. We had the gulags and Stalin, and the people loved him. We're so inferior. That was around the 90s, and Russia actually was able to defeat that. And America is only sort of dipping its toes into the ocean of self-hatred that's ahead. So I'd say Russia did a better job of that in its political system. About America, I would say that one of the things is, in the past, when America used to be a country where we had fewer laws, fewer rules, but high responsibility. You know, there used to be a time where, in America, where you could kind of do whatever you wanted, but if you killed someone in the process, you're done. You know what I mean? Or if you do something crazy, go ahead. No permits, don't worry about it. Just do whatever you want. But if you break someone's window, you're going to have to pay for that window. And that type of America that used to be, I definitely think would work much better here, because we're getting dragged down into the whole pay for insurance for this, pay for this, pay for that. Thankfully, there's not lawsuits here like there are in America, but maybe one day that'll come about too. But that sort of old school, low law, high responsibility is much better, because Russians do not like rules and laws. That's for sure. That's one thing where people think that Russians are somehow submissive because they like powerful leaders. They like powerful leaders because they don't like to, because it's a sort of negative perception of self. We're going to mention him a lot. Our good old buddy, Mr. Dugin, one time in a video made an example. As he said, the difference between Russians and a lot of people is that Russians see that they have 5 liters of vodka on the table, and they think, hell yeah, I'm taking it all. But then they kind of think, boy, wouldn't it be great if someone would force me not to drink all 5 bottles? And that's another kind of key difference between Russian and American, like the way they sort of see themselves. So in some ways, Russians actually like to be restricted because they sort of see within themselves the possibility that they could go too far, if that makes sense. Americans don't do that.
So if you were to then look at the Republic in the United States,
Yeah.
and the things that you express support for, such as, and forgive me if I'm paraphrasing, but
No.
the right to assemble, freedom of speech, freedom of association, that these are important things to have. If I understood
Talking about
that.
the Russian opinion?
No,
This
your
is what-
opinion.
Oh, my opinion. The problem is that again, we're sort of dealing with this thing of you're making a supposition, right? So you're like, does freedom of speech have value? Well, of course it does. I mean, how are we going to have a society where you can't say anything? In fact, one thing that Russia's been successful is, now Russia's more of a yes sir society, where authoritative figure said it, I say yes. So Russia's not exactly this wild free speech, a mania, super creative, independent spirit type of country. But Russia even exports a lot of engineers to China. Why? Because white guy can go in there and fire people or make changes. And because a lot of the Chinese middle management, they're terrified to do anything, because they're terrified of what people think or what they'll say or what's going to happen, the social consequences and all that. Okay? So even in China, who's very mighty and very efficient, they still have problems with the inability to say what you think, even when you need to, even when it's the going to save the factory, right? So do we need freedom in order to function? Yes, because without freedom, we're just going to stagnate. Now, do I think that because a lot of this, you should be able to say and do whatever you want? No, no one actually believes that. If you believe that, you're going to have to tolerate nudists, animal sacrifices, Satanism, pedophilia campaigns on TV, and no one wants that. So I'm someone that is mature enough, I should hope, look at the maturity on my face, that I'm mature enough to realize that there's always going to be censorship, there's always going to be things that are taboo. However, see the little trick here is everything that is banned, which shouldn't be too much. We should make maybe a short list of things that we can't say or can't discuss that's taboo in our society. But we should always be able to discuss why it's on the list, why it's banned. The government has to justify, well, why can't we swear on TV? What exactly does that do? Why does in Moscow can't we have gay parades? How is that going to affect society? Why is that bad? The question of why should always be free, but I do believe in taboos. Otherwise, it just opens up a nightmare world of pedophilia and Satanism that we're kind of, in a lot of ways, seeing in the West. Because freedom of speech is nice, but it is a blanket that the absolute worst demons in history like to hide under. So,
Well, how I have it scored is that whatever you say are, well, let's say that the system, there are some economic problems in the United States. Maybe the empire is collapsing, and so forth. Other countries are catching up, so therefore the United States isn't as competitive. So there's less jobs, and so forth. So then it would seem that there's going to be a lot of social backlash from that. Okay.
yeah.
But if the system tried to establish its credibility by saying, well, these are the values that we have, and then these are the things that are bad, then it's the natural response of people as they go through the stage of trying to understand what's wrong with the government. The first place they're going to go, or one of the first places they'll arrive at, in opposition to power groups that sometimes people identify them as government, sometimes people identify these as like corporations, but where governments and corporations have agreed on where the taboos are. But if that government or that society, including its corporate business interests, are not actually delivering on the basic things that people need to get by and to enjoy some things in life and maybe improve their lot a little bit on top of that, at least to keep up with the Joneses, that it seems that those taboos are the first place that people will go to find truth. So, for example, hear me out.
Yeah.
If so the United States calls itself a democracy, but it's not really a democracy. Corporations have a lot more control in the system than how the system gets described to like children. Okay. So, but if the government and corporations and the private media are all saying, the most important thing right now is that people have a right to a sex change operation. And meanwhile, you've got millions and millions of people out of work. Then it's very normal that those millions and millions of people out of work are going to look and think that it's the sex change operation agenda that's, in control of the system, when it might not be. Might just be another distraction. But it's certainly, what I mean to say is that the legitimating ideology of the society might not match with what the society really is. But what people will attack is the legitimating ideology before they peel the mask off and attack what's actually the real problem. So,
well, yeah, absolutely. Oh, dude, we're living in the age of fake problems.
Right.
Or problems of a very comfortable upper middle class bourgeoisie.
Yes.
That's exactly what's happening right now. But the one thing is, I kind of want to turn this around. You've been mostly asking me the questions today. I think you're in more of a relaxed mood. Normally, you're the one who drops the bomb, and I'm just trying to keep up with you. So I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts. You were just talking about how you feel that it actually works. That's really the corporations that are actually moving America. So, democracy, our official system. How does our system in America, in your opinion, actually work? What is the real mechanisms of power?
Well, it would seem that the real mechanisms of power in the United States are that you have, of course, it's corporations and governments working with corporations, and corporations that have figured out how to manipulate government. I would say that the science of sociology had reached a certain point and would continue to advance and develop. And then there was a collision or interdisciplinarity of the fields of mass and social psychology, sociology, and marketing and advertising, like Bernays, based on Freud. And that these were brought together into a monster, a leviathan, let's say. And that how to create what the public thinks and wants is a question that
Now,
is its own industry. It's produced.
yeah. Now, is this a conscious effort, a conspiracy, or it just sort of happened? We sort of walked into this point of the evolution of PR and sociology, and it just sort of happened.
Well, I think that it's both, right? So it it came about in increments, and it's been longer than any one single person's lifetime or any one single person's career, right? So people entering into it, there's already a process underway, and but certain institutions are more aware of what they're doing than others. But I would say that the right hand does know what the left hand is doing in this area. I don't think that anyone can pull the brake on it. I don't think that anyone can stop it. I think in that sense, it's like a perpetual motion machine or a technocracy. It's a machine that has its own will, its own consciousness almost, but it definitely acts like a living being. Through the bureaucratic mechanisms, through the inertia of these bureaucracies, and they each have a logic of trying to stay alive, and so they plug in to each other and function a certain way. So I absolutely agree with you that the United States is not a democracy. And I share many of your reservations and doubts about whether even such a thing is possible, right? Yeah. So I guess I would describe the United States as being something like a type of police state, but that the technology of policing has expanded beyond creating physical prisons and has created a sort of colonization of consciousness, and so that people are almost like self-policing.
Yeah,
But
I could see that, especially with my recent experiences sending my kids back to school in America. Yeah, feeling that way for sure.
Yeah, people are self-policing, but then when they get out of line, it's more easy to use medication and circuses and things like that to get people at least sedated or back in line. And that concentration camps, the United States has the highest incarceration rate and per capita and in absolute terms rather in the whole world. So
Yeah.
it's I would say that it's frankly more of a police state in the classic traditional sense. In terms of, if you were to say that an authoritarian regime was defined in part or importantly by the number of people incarcerated, or the percentage of people incarcerated, the United States leads that in both categories, hands down. Internationally, there's no country on earth with more people,
especially in terms of like percent of population too.
and
But
not
the
only
one thing is
percent, but an
actually,
absolute. That's what blew my mind. So when I learned that China had less people in prison, not a lower percentage, but
yeah,
even
less people total.
less people total in prison than the United States, then I'm like, then what's this issue with China? I mean, I'm not saying that makes it good, but it makes the United States awfully, awfully bad.
Well, yeah, because remember the Chinese are they can be a bit rough.
Yeah.
They're definitely not a gentle country when it comes to you breaking the rules. But then one thing, Joaquin, I have to say, someone who lives in Russia, I think Russia might be kind of up on the list in terms of percent of the population in jail. Of course, so
it's number two.
The viewers know, America, I think, is getting is it actually close to 2% already? No, that can't be.
It's something like this, but I think that Russia is second or third in the world of people incarcerated.
Yeah, but Russia has something like around, I think, like a 0.5%, where I know a 0.5% always sounds small in your mind, but you have to think of people who are serving time. That means 1 out of 2 every 200 people, which is actually a lot. Whereas in America, I think it's actually close to 1 out of every 100, so yeah, like 1%. But that's a lot of people. And the thing is, but I don't know. I honestly, about here being some sort of totalitarian regime, no one cares what you do, man. They just don't. I don't quite know what fills this. My only guess is that Russia has this weird modern attitude towards punishment. And there's a joke that goes, the Russian legal system is the most fair in the world. A man who killed my 2 friends got 2 years in jail, and a woman who stole 3 chickens got 3 years. Okay? And this is one thing where a lot of times the punishments for crimes are just weird. They make no sense. Like, Minor thievery can be hard time, but vehicular manslaughter, you have a good chance of getting off. Just it's very weird. There's also a lot of pardons that happen, so who knows who's serving time or when. I would say the Russian problem is not so much a police state. It's more of a lack of care, a lack of planning, goofiness, chaos, and just, kind of more of a chaotic thing. So,
Yeah,
I don't know quite how to put it. Like
yeah,
I mean, it's because I do literally because about the two men and three chickens. I actually do know someone who's convicted of the vehicular manslaughter of my former boss. Well, I don't know him, but I knew my boss who died. Drunk driving, he got 2 years, but a lot of times in the news, someone will like steal something like I don't know, a bag of something, and they'll get 3 or 5 years. It's just weird. It's very, very weird, the punishments they deal out here. It makes no sense.
I think the United States has very strange sentencing rules, and I think that Americans would relate to that absurdity because I think in the United States they have weird stuff like that. I think that in the United States, sort of getting back to your question about how I would characterize it, the biggest, I would say, first of all, the biggest mistake that people are making who are criticizing the system in America is they keep warning about rising fascism when they haven't defined the word correctly. They think like fascism is people who call themselves fascists or something, and then
who march around in uniforms and make themselves very obvious.
This is such a 1930s way of thinking about the process and the system, and that was based on.
You were talking just about. Sorry to interrupt you, but you were just talking about the evolution of sociology.
Yeah.
Maybe I would even say the evolution of human interaction, where for my grandparents, they were back in that old world where you don't do something we want, you get hit.
Yeah.
Things were very blunt and very in your face. And with the Germany and the Nazis, they're like, we want this territory, we're going to take it. Now everything's realized that directly confronting someone makes them react. It's the subtle thing.
Yes.
It's subtly wearing them down, making them feel bad, humiliated, defeated, that they can't do anything, and then you get their land. Because if you look at, especially the Russian liberals who got a few deputy positions in Moscow, a lot of them are, we should just let them rule us. I mean, there's literally a small movement in the liberal community in Russia. We should just submit to NATO, let them rule us because they'll rule us better. And that's a lot stronger and a lot more effective than actually trying to send infantry to go take something.
Yeah, that definitely resonates. When I look at, the problem is that in the United States, we can't really talk about the solutions that might be necessary to fix the problems, but I think we can talk about what the United States is, and it's certainly, I would argue that the problem is that that the terms in political science are not mutually exclusive, right? So, in other words, a republic is any system other than ruled by a hereditary monarch. Okay, but that means that plutocracies and oligarchies are within the Republican model. Mm-hmm. So, I would generally argue that if we're going to use the classical, Greek or political science terminology, I would say the United States is an oligopoly or something like this. In more modern language, I would say it's some kind of corporatist state. I would say it's a police state generally with some, let's say, constitutional and democratic traditions or overtures or
flavoring,
democratic, yes,
flavoring,
some democratic showmanship or performance art every couple years. But yeah, I'm with you. I don't think we really actually. I was hoping to disagree more, but I think you made so many pertinent points. I really enjoyed your observations
Well, thank you.
about the cultural
Over the next
dimension.
week, you got to think about something where we really strongly disagree. Because
Well,
I'm
we
sure that
probably
there's
wouldn't be so
something.
good at working on projects together. We fundamentally disagree too much.
Well,
But
yeah. See, that's the problem is that when you start making a podcast with someone that you work with on an ideological level, you tend to agree on a lot of things, but that also can create an echo chamber. So maybe some of you can tell us to go F ourselves in the comments.
yeah, I hope so.
If you feel like it,
Yeah, no, I
Uh,
mean, I can predict what people think in part. I would say this, man. It's
yeah. Well, like we'll do. Hold on. Hold on. I just say going back. Remember,
Yeah.
Because I have to say this again because I said at the beginning of the episode, but because we're actually way over the hour mark, so we're gonna cut it pretty soon. But is the fact that I don't think that democracy, the way people believe it to be in their heads, actually functions that way or actually exists, as I use the term. That doesn't mean I'm advocating that those principles are evil and that we need the rise of Hitler 2.0. No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying that because I think that a system doesn't behave the way it's promised to is not an advocate for the rise of the ultimate evil. Okay, sorry, you were saying?
well, I guess my concluding thoughts would be that that the technologies are evolving and are going to make different types of political processes different. Not only by the direct technologies about how decisions are made, but the technologies that determine the nature of our economic system. And I think that those technologies are now changing so fast that we should, at the very minimum, we need the freedom of speech and freedom of association. Let me just distinguish these two. These are different things. So there are people that I need to talk to, and there's people that I need to be seen as associated with, for the very reason that you can't agree with people if you start off from the position of looking like you fundamentally oppose their essence. So you kind of have to stand next to them and look in the same direction. Like if you and I are going to survey a piece of land together, and we're trying to figure out what we're going to do with that land, it's more likely that we'll be standing side by side and looking at from the same perspective to see about solving that problem or what we're going to do with that land. And and that might make people uncomfortable because it might make it look like we agree on everything because we're starting our position from looking at things in the same way from the same perspective. But that doesn't mean that we're going to end up in the same place or we're going to have the same solution in mind, what to do with that land. But you have to be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with somebody in order to see from their eyes, from their perspective. And so I think that's why freedom of association is so important. And guilt by association is such a negative and nasty tendency. And I think that guilt by association...
and that's unfortunately something that very much in the United States is happening right now, which is a real shame. And it might actually come to affect me as an American who works in Russia, more so than it has in the past. But yeah, the death by association is just awful because a lot of people's careers are ruined just because they had the wrong conversation, or they took the wrong photo, or they talked to someone who turned out to be not the best person. It's really a shame.
Absolutely. So I think but I think that pushing back against that starts with when institutions or when people have some agency to say, like I've done when I work with people, I say, I don't really care what you said or who you knew in the past. It's, I have a responsibility, especially if someone's work or their future is in my hands, to say, what are they actually saying and what are they actually doing? And how can I be generous in interpreting their intentions? And I think that we need a lot more of that in the West right now, because the virtue signaling and the guilt by association, if there is such a thing as democracy, and if there are such things as democratic principles that are worth fighting for, I think that the freedom of speech and freedom of association are probably two of the most fundamental ones.
Well, yeah, and especially someone sitting in Russia right now, that's really affecting U.S.-Russia relations, because now anyone who says something about trying to improve U.S.-Russia relations is somehow a traitor and spy, or if Trump tries to do anything with Putin, it's somehow bad, or he's serving Putin's interests or whatever. So yeah, U.S.-Russian relations are very much hindered by this death by association, and so things are stagnant until that changes. They're not going to change. But anyways, Joaquin, I think we did a good little job here about democracy. And the next topic is up to you. For everyone who watched our video today, please comment, especially like. Apparently, YouTube likes to get 10 likes per every 100 views, so try to help us out there. And, of course, share. Maybe in the future we'll be able to have some guests. We'll get our technology is ever improving here, our technique as well. So anyways, Tim Kirby, Joaquin Flores, the Center for Syncretic Studies, official podcast, front and center, dismissed.